Thank you so much, and good morning. Yeah, I have always been simply fascinated by the topic of communications. It is so filled with puzzles and paradoxes. For example, how many of you have ever sat through one of those awful PowerPoint presentations, dozens of slides, hundreds of bullets, yeah? All of you? And guess what? You absolutely hated it, right? And you know it didn't work. And yet knowing that, how many of you have done it to someone else? Isn't that funny? Communication is so interesting. So what I want to talk about this morning is why it's so important, how it mostly goes wrong, and how to fix it. Now, when you think about how important it is, I think it's proven really throughout history that communication is probably the single most important, if not the most powerful tool you can put in a human being's hands. It's not just how we give and receive ideas, it's how we obtain so many of those things that we want, right? That job we desperately need, that project we want to get funded, that donation we need to keep our nonprofit afloat. Incredibly important. History has proven this. History has always shown the enormous advantage that great communicators have, whether that's Steve Jobs or Winston Churchill. Although interestingly, probably the most striking example from history is far darker. The most impressive accomplishment of communication is probably Adolf Hitler. Churchill, what he was doing was rallying people against tyranny, but Hitler took the most sophisticated and most highly educated society of his time, and he persuaded them to support tyranny and madness and barbarism. That was purely through the power of his voice. So communication is unbelievably important and powerful. So what's the problem? We're not very good at it. Most of us freely admit to struggles to communicate as effectively as we'd like. And the data absolutely bears this out. We did a big study of communication in the business world, and what we found was less than 30% of business presentations are ever deemed good or better. Fully 2/3 are deemed mediocre or worse, and a really large number, a lot worse. So we have this thing that's incredibly important, but we're just not very good at it. Isn't that interesting? So what is it that's going wrong? Well, we obviously have good intentions, right? Who here sets out to punish their audience with slides? You don't do that. I think it's actually more interesting that. I think what's happening is, despite our good intentions, we get lured away, we get seduced into doing really, really stupid things. And I think a nice image here is kind of the sirens of old. Do you remember the sirens that would lure away sailors, unsuspecting sailors onto the rocks? This is a painting from a woman called Ariel Burgess. This is us. This is what happens to us. So this is you here. This is your big upcoming presentation, your big moment. Here are the rocks you're about to crash on and sink on. So what's doing that? What's luring you away? Well, I would argue it's these three deceptions or three sirens. The siren of slides, the siren of style, with a girl doing her hair, I like that, and the siren of success. Now let's talk about these. The siren of slides, I think we all understand. We just are so addicted to our technology when it comes to presentations. For many of us, presentation equals slides, but that's really weird. So here you are, you've got to do this big presentation. What's the first thing you do? You open up PowerPoint and you start typing, and you start typing. It feels good because you get the illusion of progress. But what's interesting is you keep typing and you keep typing. And all that typing may mean you're not actually doing the thinking that you should be doing. And so I'll often, what will happen is that would lead us to absolute madness. I'll often liken sort of PowerPoint and Keynote to tequila, in the sense that they're not inherently evil, but given the right circumstances, they will make you do some really stupid things. And you know exactly where this ends up. This is a slide deck built by one of the world's leading technology companies. They were trying to win a monster deal with this deck. But guess what? For a 2-hour meeting, guess what they built? 121 slides. With just absurd complexity and tiny little fonts that only dogs can hear. It's just madness, right? My wife is a counselor. She recently attended an online seminar on depression, and it was just one of these slide fire hoses. And I asked her after, I said, "Hey, honey, what did you learn?" She said, "I didn't learn anything, except now I actually am depressed," which is, that's not the outcome they were looking for at all. So the first deception, the first way we are deceived into stupidity is through slides. The second one's really interesting. It's the siren of style. Because we've been told, right, great communication is this: eye contact and body language and power posing. Like, really? That is just palpably absurd. How many of you ever left any presentation and said, oh, I really hated that, didn't make any eye contact with me at all, it was disgraceful? Of course you don't. We don't even think about that, but there are companies out there, dozens of them, in fact, a whole industry that still wants to tell you that that's what you need to get right. It's lunacy. I can prove it. A couple of years ago, I was asked to speak at a company's leadership conference. I was done, and they said, stick around to the end because the CEO is going to do this closing keynote, and he's absolutely amazing. So okay, so I stuck around, and he gets up at the end, and he checks every box. He's got the eye contact of a peregrine falcon. He's got the body language of Kramer from Seinfeld. He's witty, he's funny. He's got this impeccable suit. There's no nerves. He's checking every box. Except what I noticed was his subject was the 10 things we must get right this year. And they were really very good, but there was no narrative flow or story within the 10 things. I thought, well, that's very interesting. Anyway, so it comes to an end. The crowd goes wild. They're throwing flowers. They're throwing underwear. I mean, it's a bit cultish. And anyway, and then the meeting comes to an end. It's a true story. And I grabbed someone, well, not the underwear part, but a true story. And I just grabbed somebody at the end. And I said, what do you think? He goes, oh, it was amazing. I said, yeah, it was. Can I ask you a question? How many of the 10 things could you name for me, please? 2. That is a profound story, because what that tells us is most of what we've been told about communication is actually wrong. This guy had checked every box of traditional thinking, but he had totally failed as a communicator. And that's what happens when you're deceived into prioritizing style over substance. Now, the third deception, the third siren, is really the most interesting. It's not the one we think about very much. I'm going to call this the siren of success. And what I'm going to argue is almost all of us do not actually understand what success is in communication. That seems like a strange statement. So it's much easier if I just draw it for you. So let me just draw it for you. So hopefully this will appear on screen. Yep, great. So this is you. And you're making a big presentation to your boss. Let's imagine you're trying to get this big project funded. It's really important to you. Now, is that meeting important? Yeah. So you want it to go well. You come out like, yeah, I nailed it. But what's the problem? Is that the most important meeting? No, never. Why? Because the decision doesn't get made there. Sometime later, there's another meeting, and it's a meeting you don't get invited to. And at this meeting, the decision-making body is actually going to decide on whether your project gets funded or not. Now, that's really interesting, because when you think about it that way, what you realize is, is this important that this goes well? Yes, but actually what is more important is that this person can effectively retell your story. So what I would argue is the single most important word in communications is actually retellability or representability. Because this is always true. In sales, this is the buying group. In business, this is the management committee or the board. If you're talking to a donor, this is the grant committee. It's always true. Now, this should change the way we think about communications completely, because the deception is we fixate on the first meeting, so we think, yeah, first meeting success, but no. Is your message so crisp, so clean, so compelling that actually you can achieve second meeting success? Now, that's really profound. So those are our 3 deceptions, the lies we've been told that cause us to do really stupid things. How many of us here have been deceived by one or all 3 of these things? Okay, all of us. So the question becomes, how do you solve this? Can this be solved? And that's not an academic question, because every one of you in this room will have many, many times in your lives where you're making a really important presentation, and it really, really needs to go well. So this is personal. How do you make sure you can do that? Well, there is actually a tool I want to show you that will completely defeat these 3 sirens. I know TED Talks are lofty and they don't always descend into the practical, but I want to give you a very, very practical tool here. The tool is called the pyramid of planned outcome. And it's incredibly simple. It's cocktail napkin stuff. So if I was building any message, presentation, anything, including a TED Talk, what would I do? Well, I'd start at the top, and I'm simply going to think about what is it that I want my audience to do? What action do I want them to take? What decision do I want them to make? And that's very, very important. But what that raises is a very interesting question. How do we make decisions? Well, let me illustrate that. Imagine I wanted you to make a decision, which was to raise your hand and play a game with me. We don't have time. We won't do it. And here are the rules of the game. I'll ask you a simple trivia question. If you get it right, you get $10. You get it wrong, you owe me $1, and you can ask a friend for help if you want. Now, if we played that game, somebody here would raise their hand. And the moment you did that, the moment you raise your hand, you would be illustrating one of the single most important principles of communication, which is this. In human beings, action is preceded by belief. In other words, we take decisions based on the beliefs we have about that decision. So if you had raised your hand, it would have been for 3 reasons. One is, I believe, I could probably answer that. He said it was easy. 2 is, I like the risk reward. 10 for 1, yeah, that works. And 3 is, I'm not going to be embarrassed because I can get help if I need it, right? And I can prove that, because if I said I'm going to ask you a question from particle physics, it's 20 if you win, 20 to me if you lose, and you're on your own. Do you still make a decision? Yes, not going to play that game. Why? 3 new beliefs. I'm not going to be able to answer that question. I hate the risk reward, and I'm bound to be embarrassed. So come with me on this. So if in human beings, action is preceded by belief, and if that's true, what that means is the single most important question you ever ask when designing any presentation is this. Well, what does my audience need to believe in order to take the action I want them to take, to hire me, whatever it is? Now, you think that through, and you write that in the middle of this pyramid, and what that gives you is a small number of beliefs or big ideas. And that's what we want, a powerful, ideas-driven narrative. Now, once you've got there, it's relatively straightforward, because if you know what the beliefs are, then you simply ask a final question. Okay, well, what would my audience need to know in order to believe that? What sort of facts or data or proofs? And you just write them at the bottom, kind of aligned under the supporting idea. It's incredibly simple, but it's incredibly powerful. Now, I get that that's totally academic and theoretical. So let me kind of wrap up by showing you a really, really powerful example of this in real life. I was asked to speak at a fundraising banquet for a non-profit that wanted to raise money for an overnight shelter for homeless teenagers. This is a tragic situation, and one that absolutely needs to be solved. So I sat down to think about, how would I do this banquet presentation? Well, the action obviously is very straightforward. Wanted people to give to the overnight shelter. So now I start thinking about, okay, well, what would the audience need to believe? Now, it's really interesting. I spoke to the executive director, and she said, it's really interesting. Homeless teenagers will make themselves look really scary. But they do that to defend themselves against the many dangers that they face, because it's such a perilous environment. But the weird thing about that is, the donors would look at these really scary kids and go, I don't want to give to them. They're just bad kids. So the light goes on in my brain like, okay, there's the first big idea. The first big idea is, guys, these are not bad kids. They deserve our love, not our condemnation. That was, in fact, my opening. Now, that's good, but it doesn't quite get you there, because I also knew the audience would know that this organization had a daycare center. So they could easily look at this and go, well, okay, they're not bad kids, but we already have a daycare center, don't we? Yes, except, second big idea, the real danger comes after dark. What happens when a kid's put out on the street at 7 o'clock at night in the middle of January? Now, by the way, at this point, you can just see a really good example of how you can prove any idea. How would I have proved that idea? I did that with one picture, just a kid sleeping in a dumpster. It's a picture that they had at this organization, sleeping in the dumpster in the middle of winter. Now, that's great. It's not quite there yet. So they would get that they're not bad kids. They get that they're in danger, but they might easily be asking, well, okay, but is this the best use of my money? I mean, there's a lot of places I can give. Is this a really good place to me invest? I think that led to the final and very powerful idea, because what I needed them to believe is that this isn't just any old fundraising banquet and any old need. In fact, you're going to save a life tonight. Your gift will actually save lives. And there it is. That was the intellectual argument, the intellectual architecture of an 8-minute presentation. Now, what I want you to see is how it completely solves my 3 problems. Not even thinking about slides. Okay, I'll get to slides later, but what I'm thinking about is the intellectual architecture, and that's what matters. So the slide tail isn't wagging the content dog. So slides, yes, but later. The second thing, it completely solves the style siren. I'm not thinking about how I'm going to present this. I'm thinking about what I need to say and why. I'll think about how I present it later. And then finally, and most importantly, I've completely solved my retellability problem, because a crisp, simple, ideas-driven narrative is the most retellable story you can tell, because ideas are so sticky to the brain. And hello, isn't that what TED is in fact all about? So this model and tool is literally cocktail napkin stuff, and it will completely transform your communication. You're probably wondering, did we raise the money? And we did. It was very successful, and that was very, very important. But the only reason I'm telling you that is because this is you. All of you here, all of us, have many times in our lives where we need to make a critical presentation, and it needs to go well, and we cannot afford to be dragged onto the rocks of any of those 3 problems. And that's what I hope you can take out of this morning. So what was my action? I want you to commit to being a better, world-class communicator. And how can you get there? There's 3 key ideas. Number 1, communication's vital. We need to be good at it, so beware the 3 sirens. 2, retellability is the standard to aim for, and it is the key that will unlock everything else. And 3, the pyramid is the tool that will get you there. Thank you very much for your time this morning.